morning. Welcome, everyone.
Sorry.
No worries. Thank you for joining us. So last week we discussed the history of the thinking, of how the thinking about women in Torah learning changed over time. And we saw the Rebbe's revolutionary approach. And in that, the same text which indicated that Torah learning is not for women, the Rebbe turned it around and said, for the very same reasons, it's time that women do study Torah. Now, when the Rebbe makes his case, the first thing he says there is, whatever your understandings of that passage in the Talmud is, which seem to indicate that women shouldn't learn, it contradicts the history of women who did learn, even though they were an anomaly. This is what the Rebbe writes there. And in the footnotes, he writes beginning in the Talmudic era, and in the footnotes there he cites to Beruria, one of the women we're going to be discussing tonight, and he mentions others, which we will get to in future classes. So today we're going to be looking at some of those women over the next 4 classes, and today 3 specifically. What's interesting is that the first woman we're going to look at today is Devorah, the prophetess. We're going to look about her learning, her scholarship specifically. There's more to say about her story, her leadership as of the Jewish people, military leadership, but we're looking specifically at her scholarship because that's our focus. And I was thinking about why the Rebbe didn't cite that as the first example. Why Beruria? And I think the reason is because Beruria is a Talmudic sage. She is a sage of the Talmud, as we'll see. And this statement, which says that women shouldn't learn, or indicates that women shouldn't learn, is stated around the same time that Beruria is living. So, like as proof, so to speak, that the statement is not a qualifier, meaning that no women could ever learn, you have people in the same time conversing and learning with a woman. That's kind of where the Rebbe puts Beruria first, even though there predates learning from women in Beruria, as we'll see tonight. Devorah was a scholar. So I think that's the reason why the Rebbe put Beruria as an example, because that indicates the time period of probably the same people who are having the conversation about how to understand, or certainly the same circles or the same study halls where they may have been discussing the statement about whether women should or shouldn't learn. In those very same study halls and in those very same scholars would have conversed, as we'll see, with Beruria, with a woman. So maybe that's why they're besides to her as an example. So that's going to come second. And then third is one very cool passage. We'll conclude with this, hopefully we'll get there tonight, of a travel diary and someone who ends up in Babylonia and meets a woman who's leading the yeshiva, which is very cool. Okay, so let's begin then. So we'll start with Devorah, the prophetess. So on the first page, kind of like on either side, can we give like an outline of her life, and we'll kind of go just through it quickly to give the context, and then we'll look into the scholarship component. So this is within a couple hundred years after the Jews enter Israel under Joshua. So it's really, really early in our history. So therefore I write the first note there is before a united kingdom of Israel, right? The first united kingdom of Israel is under King David. Until that point, or somewhat under Shaul also there's a united kingdom, but really under King David, he solidifies the Jewish people as one nation with the capital in the center, Jerusalem. Until that point, each of the 12 tribes were like independent city-states, nation-states, which kind of ran their own little things. And they were more like a confederacy, loosely, under what was called a judge. And only when, in a lot of these stories, like the pre-King David stories, you'll hear very specific things like they came to get an army from this tribe, and that tribe came to the aid of that tribe, and the judge is negotiating between tribes to help, to get one tribe to help another tribe in their issues with a neighboring oppressor or something with the Canaanites, right? So it's like a loose confederacy of these 12 tribes, and this confederacy is held together by a judge. And usually, as this happens in the biblical narrative, the Jews sin, they get attacked, they look to central leadership, the judge comes and saves them. That's pretty much what happens very often. The judge, gives them a rousing speech, gets them to do teshuvah, they wage battle, and they're successful. And that's pretty much what happens to Devorah, right? So just reading on the left side, so it's before United Kingdom of Israel. Her predecessors are Othniel, Ehud, and Shamgar. Those are the 3 prophets before her, so she's very early on. The 4 judges. You can look up her story in the book of Judges, chapters 4 and 5, which was read as the Haftarah 2 weeks ago, right? Because she sings a song after her success in battle, and that's like parallel to the song at the sea with Miriam involved there. So it's like a woman relationship, a song relationship, a poem. Song means poem, really. And So she's read, her story's read in Haftorah 2 weeks ago. And then having abandoned Torah, the Jews are oppressed by King Yavin of Chatzar, a Canaanite king, and a general Sisera, that F doesn't belong there. I don't know if you have it in your text, but in my screen's there, for 20 years. And until finally she inspires the nation to do teshuvah. And along with Barak, she calls for this gentleman Barak, who is her husband, at least according to the majority opinion, as we'll see. They led them into successful battle against the Canaanites, the conclusion of which also came through another woman named Jael. Right? This is a story where Barak and the Jewish army are successfully pushing back Sisera and his army. Sisera runs away, stays overnight in someone who he thinks is a friendly. There's a woman there who's a Jew, and she offers him wine. He goes to sleep. She takes the peg of her tent and basically skulls him. He dies, and that's how the story ends. And Sisera comes and finally catches up with him and finds that he's already dead in the hands of some woman. And then Devorah wrote a song of praise to God, right? That's the famous Shiras Devorah, which we read 2 weeks ago. And she reigned for 40 years. It's a long time. Okay, so let's go now to the text on page 2, which describes her. So the storyline itself, that's the storyline which plays out in chapters 4 and 5. I'm just going to read the opening lines, which you'll see how the Gemara, the Talmud, unpacks some of the words here to indicate to us the level of her scholarship, which is kind of what we're going to be doing. So it's a little bit of a Talmudic exercise in going through how the Gemara understands the text and extrapolating the level of her scholarship. So let's see. So the verse reads, this is chapter 4, verse 4. Now Deborah was a woman prophetess. In English, the word would just be prophetess, I suppose. The wife of Lapidut. Let's put a bookmark on that word, Lapidus. She judged Israel at that time. And she sat under the palm tree of Deborah, between Ramah and Bethel, in the mountain of Ephraim, and the children of Israel came up to her for judgment. What kind of judgment would they be coming for? What kind of judgment? Just legal questions, like legal disputes, right? This is classic rabbinic duties. Judge people when there is an issue. So she's doing that. We'll see how the Talmud breaks that down. And she sent and called Barak, the son of Abinoam, out of Kedesh Naphtali, and she said to him, indeed the Lord God of Israel commanded, go and draw toward Mount Tabor, and take with you 10,000 men of the children of Naphtali and the children of Zebulun. Like she's telling him which tribes to collect the people from, and they're going to go fight this King Yavin. Okay, so there's a few things we're going to look at. Number one, she's calling a man named Barak to come fight, but here describes her as the wife of Lapidus, or Eshet Lapidut, wife of Lapidus. So who are these two different men? Lapidus and then Barak. What's the story? Number one. Number two, she's a judge, but her judge is specifically under a palm tree. It's like very important for us to know that she sits under a palm tree. What's the story there? And thirdly, she says to Barak, the Lord commanded me, or the Lord commanded to go and fight. When did the Lord command this? The verse doesn't say God spoke to Deborah saying. It doesn't say that. So those are the three things we're going to look at, and in so doing, we'll discover her scholarship. Okay, so this is the commentary on the verse itself, the words wife of Lapidot. What does that mean? So, as we're going to see here, none of these three interpretations actually mean that her husband's name was Lapidus, but rather to think of Eshet Lapidut as Eshet Chayil. Eshet Chayil doesn't mean the wife of Chayil. It's a woman of Chayil, Chayil being valor. So Eshet Lapidut doesn't mean married to Lapidut, but rather a woman of Lapidut. So what does Lapidut mean? So three different interpretations. Rashi picks up from the Talmud, which says she prepared wicks for the sanctuary, for the temple. This is pre-temple, so it would have been like the Mishkan. Mitzuda David, another classic commentary on the Torah, on Tanakh, which says that is to say a woman of valor. Right? He's paralleling Eshet Chayil, zealous in her deeds as a torch of fire. Lapidut meaning a torch. So either she actually made torches for the sanctuary, so she's a woman of torches, she made torches, or she was like a torch, her personality. She was this firebrand of a torch woman. So they called her Eshet Lapidut, like the strong firebrand of a woman. That's another way of understanding that word, Eshet Lapidut. And finally, they said that he is Barak, the son of Avinoam, since Barak, lightning, and Lapidut, torches, are close in meaning. So either it's actually her husband, but her husband being Barak, or lapidut is indicative of her personality, or perhaps all three. And a kind of a poetic way of saying she's the wife of lapidut, and also she's a woman of lapidut, a woman involved in providing flames to the temple, or she herself was a kind of flame personality. Okay. The second item we said was, she judged the people, she sat at a palm tree. So the Gemara comments, if we're unclear, please stop me at any point. So this is now the Gemara speaking here. The Talmud Megillah 14a. With regard to Devorah, it says, and she sat under a palm tree. The Gemara asks, what is different and unique with regard to her sitting under a palm tree that there's a need for it to be written? Like, who cares where she sat? She sat in her office. No. Scripture says she sat under a palm tree. So explains the Gemara, Rabbi Shimon ben Avishalom said, it is due to the prohibition against being alone together with a man. So if she's a rabbi and someone's coming into her office to chat, so she can't be in a private, secluded area. This is not appropriate. So she sat under a palm tree, considering, I guess, that most of her litigants would have been men. So her office was outdoors in the open public, so there's no suspicion of anything. Right? So she's following the laws of what's known as yichud. Yichud meaning the seclusion of man and woman. Alternatively, the verse means, just as a palm tree has only one heart, as a palm tree does not send out separate branches, but only has one main trunk, so too the Jewish people in that generation had only one heart directed to the Father in heaven because of her work. So either she metaphorically was a palm tree, or she literally sat under a palm tree because she wanted to be open and without suspicion, and without violating the laws of yichud, or again, maybe both. Okay, so now we're going to go on a little bit of a Talmudic rabbit hole to unpack this a bit. Okay, so the Gemara seems rather simple. She's trying to avoid the laws of yichud, she's trying to avoid the laws of seclusion, so she's outdoors under a palm tree, so there's no violation of the law. Okay, but there's a few problems here. Number one, the verse says judge. Judge usually implies there's more than one litigant. Now usually the issue of enclosed suspicion is only with two people, one man, one woman. But here there's going to be at least two men. So maybe it isn't a problem to be in her office. Problem number two is, don't we have three judges in a Jewish court? So she wouldn't have been alone anyway. I described earlier that she's consulting with someone in her office. A little poetic license. But the verse actually says judge, which implies she's sitting in a court and she's judging, presumably between two litigants. So there's always at least three people in the room. Number one. Number two, there would have been two other judges too, putting aside the fact that a woman is actually sitting on a court. There's commentaries that discuss that as well. So let's see how some of the commentaries on the Gemara deal with this. So on the next page, 5. So Rashi writes, just explaining the palm tree scenario, right? The palm tree is tall with no shade, and thus no man could be alone with her like they would be in her home. Okay, that's why she's under the palm tree. Now Tosfos adds, when would she be with a man? When they would come in judgment, giving us that context. Okay, well, what is Tosfos adding here? What are the Tosfos adding here? We know that. The verse says they would come to her in judgment. But Tosfos adds, no, when they would come in judgment, there was the concern of seclusion, and therefore she was in the palm tree. Isn't that implied by the verse itself? Look, what's Tosfos adding? So here we have Yavitz. Anybody remember Yavitz? Rabbi Yaakov Emden. We spoke about him on Shabbos in the summer. He was that controversial guy who accused the other rabbi of being a Sabbatean. This is him talking. Yeah. When
you say it,
it's that personality. So he I think we mentioned this then. He had his own printing press, so he would print Talmuds and then insert his glosses and commentary. Because why not, right? Well, actually, he used to write. He wrote prolifically, and on the margins of all books he owned, he put his own writings in and then would publish them. Okay, so this comes from one of those comments, and this is a translation by yours truly. He says, though there is always more than one man in judgment, so you always have two litigants, which means that there really isn't any concern of seclusion, because there's one woman with two men, and presumably they would keep each other in check. Nevertheless, if the two men are of ill repute, the prohibition against seclusion is in effect. So the law is, if the two men are people who have reputation, then the laws do apply. Okay? For this reason, okay, so let's keep that in mind. Continues Yavitz. For this reason, the Tosafos said, when they come in judgment, as we are taught, the Mishnah says, a judge must treat the litigants as wicked when they enter. In other words, the judge cannot show favoritism to any litigants. So the judge has to assume that when they walk in here, both of them are lying, and you have to get to the bottom of it. So now if you have to treat the litigants as wicked people, liars, then you have to treat them as men of ill repute, in which case you cannot be secluded with those two men. Which is why Tosfos adds, you know when there's a problem of them secluding? When they come in judgment. Later on, we'll discover that they weren't lying at all, and then there's no issue of seclusion because it's more than one person. But when they arrive in judgment, there's the issue. And therefore, she was under the palm tree. Following? Now he adds, what about the other two judges? And here gets to her level of scholarship. And she would stand in judgment alone as an expert, because this is the halacha. Usually, a court has to have 3 judges. But if you're speaking of the absolute leader of the generation, who is the absolute accepted scholar by all of rabbinic and Jewish authority throughout the world, and this person can stand in judgment alone. And she was one such woman. And therefore, the 2 guys, there's no 2 other judges. It's just her and the litigants. Thus, there's the issue of seclusion. Thus, she's under the palm tree. So this little Talmudic rabbit hole gives us an idea of the level of her scholarship, to the point that she would be sitting alone, and Jews, I guess unanimously, would have trusted her to be sitting in judgment, even if the litigants, or probably most of her litigants, would have been male. So that's I thought something interesting about Devorah. Okay, and finally, the last thing I said we'll discuss is, she calls Barak and says, indeed the Lord God of Israel commanded that you got to collect people and fight the Canaanites. So when did the Lord command? So Rashi says, this is quite interesting actually. The commandment came through Moses. Deuteronomy 20:17, you shall totally destroy them. When there's a people oppressing the Jewish people, it's your job to go and deal with them. Hopefully that's what you're doing out in Israel right now, right? So what this means is, at least in Rashi's interpretation, when she says God commanded, she's actually not acting as prophetess. God spoke to me and told you. She's actually acting as the head of the Sanhedrin, the head of the Jewish court, whose job it is to rule on when it's a mitzvah to go to battle. Which again tells you the level of her accepted scholarship as a leader of not just the people on a political level, but on a Torah level, because only someone who's sitting in the seat of the high court can make a ruling that says we're now faced with a commandment by Torah law to go to battle. No one else can make that call. Right? Though, as we see here, others give the other interpretation that simply she was giving prophecy. Simply, whatever, it's prophecy, but as opposed to her role as a Torah leader. Okay, as the Matsuda David writes, in truth, God did command it, as it was told to her in prophecy, but it was not mentioned in the text. Okay, Radak addresses why she has to call Barak if Barak is her husband, right? We said that Eshet Lapidut doesn't mean her husband is Lapidut, but rather this is a part of her personality. She's a Lapidut person, and Barak is her husband, so why is she calling for her husband from somewhere? And this is interesting. If she was his wife, she was separated from the time of her becoming a prophetess and going to sit under the palm tree. Like Moses would have separated from his wife when he ascended to prophecy, she would have separated from her husband when she became a prophetess. And therefore she had to go summon him. Which, by the way, the Talmud elsewhere speaks ill of the fact that she summoned her husband. Just by the way. As opposed to her going to him. Just putting it out there. Nonetheless, now she's had to call him, telling him the prophecy that God had spoke to her. Okay, so this is as far as I can put together on Devorah's scholarship on 2 major grounds. Number one, sorry? Yeah? Okay. Number one, that she would judge the Jewish people as the ruler of as a court would, and not with other judges on her own accord. She would judge them as evidenced by the fact that she was concerned with being secluded with 2 men at once. And as Rashi's interpretation here is, she's using the power of Jewish law to rule on a major issue, which is going to battle. Okay, what do you want to say?
I was just wondering if the Talmud had a problem with the fact that a woman was summoning her husband, or even if a man were to summon his wife. Is that just disrespectful to summon your spouse?
I have to go look at the context.
Do men in the Talmud summon their wives? Because I mean,
Achashverosh is spoken down to for summoning his wife, right? He's like told off because of that.
well,
So-
she was above him. I mean,
Maybe.
because she was.
I have to look at the context of the Gemara there again. I don't remember.
Okay. No, I just, I mean,
It's curiosity.
It's very impolite now to scream to
Right.
another room if you're waiting for your husband.
Yeah. Okay. So that's Devorah. Sorry.
We're not just saying calling out to get their attention, it's a suggestive call out, right?
No, he was. She was like sending her lackeys to go summon him from wherever to inform him that it's time to go to battle,
Oh,
as opposed to her going down to his
Oh.
quarters and saying, we should go to battle.
okay, wow.
Right? She's the prophetess. She's the leader of the Jewish people, so she's summoning whoever she wants. Time to go to war, right? That's what's happening here. No, the recording didn't go. So be it. Okay. It's too bad. Sorry? I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. She just appears, actually. It just says, and Devorah was. That's how it starts and introduces her. But she's the only, to the best of my knowledge, the only judge. There are other prophetesses, 7 in total, if I remember correctly, but she's the only one that has this title of judge, which implies a Torah leadership, not just a prophetic one. Okay, the next woman is Beruria. You cannot do a series on women in Torah scholarship without highlighting Beruria, and she requires her own series to go through her and understand her and discover her scholarship and so on. But we'll do at least an overview of some of these stuff. So let's, again, the first page here, just an outline of the era and her life, and then we'll get into the details. So this is, as you can see, the 2nd century. So we're talking now within the 1st century after the destruction of the Second Temple. So we're in Israel, but post-destruction during the Roman occupation and persecution. We spoke about this in the last series, where you had Rabbi Shimon Yochanan ben Zakkai, one of the leaders of the Jewish people, who negotiated with Vespasian, the Roman emperor, to keep the academy from being destroyed. Right? He lobbied for that successfully. So the Jews are still living in Rome, but under Roman occupation. So there's all kinds of persecutory measures going on. You have the Bar Kokhba rebellion happening sometime around now. You have like the Masada story happening at this time. It's during this period of time. And there's like scholars really running from town to town, trying to stay alive and trying to keep their Torah going, and they're rushing to write the Mishnah, which becomes the first body of text of the oral tradition, as we spoke about in the last series. So this is during this time period. So she is the daughter of Rabbi Hananya ben Pradyon, who is a rabbi and faithful charity administrator in the city of Sichni in the Lower Galilee. I looked it up. I think it's a Arab town today, this little village, but this was his position. He is one of the 10 martyrs. This is a big part of her life story, as we'll see, is the death of her father and what happened as a result. We read about him on Yom Kippur. I'm not sure if you remember, but he's the one that was wrapped in a Torah scroll.
Oh, wow.
That's her father, Rabbi Hananya ben Pradyon. So she's the daughter of this illustrious scholar, and she marries one of the greatest scholars of all time, Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir Balanes. Quoted throughout the Mishnah, right? He is a major scholar, major figure, contemporary of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, student of Rabbi Akiva, that generation, one of the major scholars of the Mishnaic era. The sages actually a number of times say, look, we don't fully get what you're saying, but we know you're much smarter, so we acquiesce. Like, that was her husband. Actually, throughout the Talmud, every now and again, you get bits and pieces about their relationship, which is a nice thing. Okay, so now as to her scholarship, we have, number one, an intense personal study regimen. It shouldn't say regiment. She didn't have an army. It's a regimen. Little typo. She was strong-minded, independent, compassionate, and witty scholar. We're going to go through all those personality traits from the text. Admired in the male-dominated circles of the Tanaim, the great scholars of the Mishnah. We'll see some texts that indicate that as well. Faith in the face of personal tragedy. We'll look at that too. And she passes in a tragic event. I'm going to put a question mark on that last one because it's a bit controversial, and we'll go through the controversy. Okay, so let's unpack it. Number one, her intense personal study regimen. The Talmud tells us, Rabbi Simlai told Rabbi Yochanan, teach me the book of genealogies in 3 months. Genealogies was this book that the sages had. It's a very complex book. It's often cited as one of those hard books to read. So Rabbi Simlai is asking Rabbi Yochanan, I have 3 months now, teach me the whole book. Rabbi Yochanan took a clod of dirt, threw it at him, and said, Beruria, wife of Rabbi Meir and daughter of Rabbi Hananya ben Tradion, was so sharp and had such a good memory that she learned 300 halachot in 1 day from 300 sages. And nonetheless, she did not fulfill her responsibility to properly learn the book of genealogies in 3 years because it is especially long and difficult. And you say that I should teach it to you in 3 months? After your inappropriate request, I'm not inclined to teach you at all. But who does he cite as a sample for a genius who took 3 years? Is Beruria. It's like a sample genius. There's this genius woman who took 3 years to finish it. You want to do it in 3 months? Just kind of tells you how the sages thought about her, and it also tells you what she was up to. 300 halachot every day. I hope to get that in a year. A year. If I remember 300 halachot period, that'd be good. Never mind in 1 day. Right? 300 halachot from 300 sages in 1 day. So that's a pretty big deal. Okay, so now here are some conversations that come up scattered throughout the Talmud about her, and some of them tell us about her wit. Some tell us about her compassion. The first one actually we'll see is about her compassion. And some tell us about how just her strong personality in terms of her mind and thinking. So this is how the Gemara reads. There were these hooligans in Rabbi Meir's neighborhood, Rabbi Beruria's husband, who caused them a great deal of anguish. Rabbi Meir prayed for God to have mercy on them, and they should die. They're living such horrible lives. Just put an end to it. Rabbi Meir's wife, Beruria, said to him, what are you thinking? On what basis do you pray for the death of these hooligans? Do you base yourself on the verse as it is written, let sins cease from the land, which you interpret to mean that the world be better if the wicked were destroyed? But is it written, let sinners cease? Let sins cease is written. That phrase is what you say in modern parlance, retweeted throughout all of Torah literature. You want sins to stop, not sinners. She coined that phrase. It's actually the Chabad motif. So the person's doing sins, therefore he's a bad person, he's a Jew. You want sins to end, not the sinners to end. She coined that phrase and telling her husband, calling him out for praying for the death of sinners. And she continued, one should pray for an end of the transgressions, not for the demise of the transgressors themselves. Moreover, continues Beruria on the next page, go to the end of the verse where it says, and the wicked will be no more. If, as you suggest, transgressors shall cease refers to the demise of the evil doers themselves, how is it possible that the wicked will be no more, i.e., they will no longer be evil? Right? The verse reads, and the wicked should be no longer wicked. If they already are dead, then obviously they're not wicked anymore. Why is the verse repeating itself? So it must be that they're still alive, but they're no longer wicked. Rather, pray for God to have mercy on them, that they should repent. As if they repent, then the wicked will be no more, as they will have repented. This passage is also cited in Halacha, by the way. There's a halachic discussion. We once learned this here a couple of years ago, maybe. Are you allowed to pray for someone else to do teshuvah? Because you're seemingly messing with their free choice. And this story is cited as, yes, you may, and you can and should. And this is the source for that idea. Yeah. Good question.
So how does all this come into play?
Mostly non-Jews, I would assume. But you have to go verse by verse and unpack it. But this idea is cited in Halacha for sure. Yeah. So Meir saw that Beruria was correct, and he prayed for God to have mercy on them, and they repented. So his prayers were successful. So this kind of gives you her compassionate scholarship. Now here we have some of her strong-minded, witty scholarship. We're on page 11. Rabbi Yosef Glili was walking along the way and met Beruria. He said to her, "On which path shall we walk in order to get to Lud?" She said to him, "Foolish Galilean," Yossi HaGalili, he came from the Galilee. "Didn't the sages say, do not talk much with women? You should have said your question more succinctly. Which way to Lud? Why adding this whole thing about you walking? Not important. Be direct." She's using Talmudic language, which is ironically often used like as anti-feminist, in that it says you're not supposed to talk too much to women, and she's using it to her advantage, right? To kind of flip on the whole thing. What are you chatting with me for? This is not the way it goes. Just ask me the question and I'll answer. So the next story in the Gemara is a very similar story. Beruria came across a certain student who was whispering his studies rather than raising his voice. She kicked him and said to him, page 12, "Isn't it written as follows? Ordered in all things and secure." Your learning should be ordered in all things and secure, which indicates that if the Torah is ordered in your 248 limbs, i.e. if you exert your entire body in studying it, it will be secure, and if not, it will not be secure. This is actually cited to in Tanya. Tanya describes this, quotes this, as the more a person physically of himself he invests in their learning, the more they'll remember it. You read something casually, you forget it, but when you read and sweat and you shuckle and you move your hands like this, then you remember it a little better. So this comes from her. She's the one that says this. She's telling this guy, you're whispering and reading your Torah casually. Get more into it. You should be yelling and screaming and read your Torah out loud, and then you'll remember it, because it's going to be ordered in your whole body, not just reading it nonchalantly. So the Gemara relates that it was a similar taught in the Breita. Rabbi Lezer had a student who would study quietly, and after 3 years, he forgot his studies, based on Beruria's teaching. So you see some of her, like, obviously she's a firebrand, a witty personality, with this compassionate side to her as well. Sorry? Admired in the male-dominated circles of the Tanaim. That was the other thing I wrote about her. So 2 sources in which she is cited to. And both of these sources are in the Talmudic text. That's Tosefta. Tosefta is the Mishnaic text that didn't make it to the last redaction of the Mishnah. So just a little background. Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, who compiled the Mishnah, collects all of these notes and organizes them and makes them into the Mishnah. But there's all kinds of notes that didn't make it into the final cut. And they were subsequently organized by other scholars and then published in books called Tosefta, Breita, and Mechilta. Maybe I'm missing one. Anyway, this finds itself in one of those texts. But I looked it up to be certain of this, and in Rambam's Code of Jewish Law, this law is cited to. Rambam never cites sources, so he won't say Beruria said, but the law is there, which means it became the final halachic ruling, which is, regarding a kalustera, a door bolt, Rabbi Tarfon being a contemporary, obviously of her, but a friend/teacher to Rabbi Akiva. That's who Rabbi Tarfon is. So Rabbi Tarfon declares it impure, but the sages declare it pure. So what they're talking about here is, what they're talking about here is the law that in order for something to be susceptible to impurity, it has to be an actual vessel. So a stick on the ground is not susceptible to impurity. But if you took that stick and shaped it into a spoon, now it is. Okay? So the question is a door bolt, which is basically just a peg, is it a vessel or a stick? So is it susceptible to impurity or not? So B'tarfin said, it is impure. The sages say pure. Beruria says, one may remove it from this doorway and hang it in the neighboring doorway on Shabbat. On Shabbat, you cannot take apart vessels. She's saying it's so little of a vessel, it's just a peg, that you can even take it out and put it into some other door if you wanted to. It's irrelevant. On Shabbos, you can do that. It's irrelevant. So when these words were spoken by Rabbi Yeshua, who is her husband's teacher, he said, Beruria has spoken well. And that becomes the halacha. So where's she having this conversation? I assume somewhere in some study hall. And there's at least Rabbi Tarfon, some other sages, and Rabbi Yeshua present. Furthermore, I couldn't find an English translation to this one, so it's in Hebrew. Also from Tosefta, also from the laws of purity and impurity. So it's referring to a similar set of laws, a brick oven that's been covered in a clay, and it now became impure. Now, the law is if the vessel lost its status as vessel, it's now pure again. So if you had, let's say, a glass bowl, and you shattered the glass bowl, the shards are no longer impure because it no longer retains its original status of being a bowl, and therefore the shards are completely pure, even though while it was together, it's pure. Unless the shards can somehow retain its original usage that it had from the bowl, maybe it would be impure. But otherwise, it's pure. So there's all kinds of discussion as to at what point does a vessel lose its status as the original vessel. Okay? So here's a discussion on a brick oven covered in clay. At what point is it broken down so much that it's no longer a vessel? And that's what it says here. Me'en matai tarato, when does it become pure? So Rabbi Chalafta, man of Kfar Hananya, says, I asked this question by Shimon, son of Hananya. Now this Shimon, son of Hananya, asked this same question from the son of Rabbi Hanina ben Trajan. Hanina ben Trajan is Beruria's father, Hananya ben Trajan, right? So Shimon is asking Beruria's brother, yeah? And he said, you have to not just take apart the clay, but actually have moved it from one place to another. Once you move it away from its original spot, it's no longer the same oven. While it's still in the same spot, even if you remove the clay, it's still the same oven and therefore it's still impure. Ubito omeret, but the daughter of Rabbi Hananya ben Trajan said, the daughter being presumably Beruria, but maybe another sister, we'll see soon. She said, once you remove the outer layer, when you remove the outer layer, you remove the clay, it's no longer the same oven anymore, it's pure. She's being lenient in both of these cases, by the way. She makes the peg not a vessel, and she says all you need to do to make the oven pure is remove the outer layer of the clay. And the Gemara, the text concludes, the Tosefta concludes, when these words were said in the presence of Rabbi Huda ben Baba, he said, Yafa amrabita mahu. The daughter said better than he did. She said better than her brother. And this is the halacha indeed. Okay. So these are two places in which we see that she was quoted in the context of Talmudic discussion in halacha amongst Tanoim. And in each of these cases, the sages acknowledged and kept it for posterity that she is correct. And this is beyond the statements she said to her husband about praying for them to repent rather than die, which is in halacha as well. Okay, so now this is an absolutely incredible story, very, very moving story about her faith in the face of personal tragedy. I'm just going to read it as is because the story is, it's a very moving story. So it's Midrash Mishlei, 31:2. So Mishlei is a book by Shlomo HaMelech, King Solomon, book of Proverbs in English, and chapter 31 is Eshet Chayil. So the Mishlei, this Midrash is discussing the Eshet Chayil. It's going through it and explaining it line by line. So it says, a valiant woman who can find, right? Eshet Chayil miyimtza. So now the Midrash is going to elaborate to describe what's like the prototype Eshet Chayil. So here's the story that the Midrash tells us to inform us of what exemplifies an Eshet Chayil. They relayed the following story. There was a story about Rabbi Meir who was sitting and expounding in the study hall on Shabbat afternoon when two of his sons died. What did their mother do? Their mother being Beruria, right, Rabbi Meir's wife. She placed both of them on a bed and spread a sheet over them. At the end of Shabbat, Rabbi Meir came home from the study hall. He said to her, where are my two sons? She said, they went to the study hall. He said to her, I scanned the study hall and I did not see them. Right? Rabbi Meir was one giving the class. He was giving the lecture. He didn't see his sons there. She gave him the cup of Havdalah and he recited Havdalah. It's Saturday night. He repeated it and said, where are my two sons? He realizes she's stalling. She said, they went elsewhere and they're coming soon, or they're coming now. She placed food in front of him and he ate and he blessed, right? He did the benching. After he recited the grace, the Birchat HaMazon, she said to him, I have a question to ask you. He said to her, say your question. She said to him, if he's not suspicious already, he's becoming more suspicious now. She said to him, Rabbi, before today, a man came and deposited something with me, and now he is coming to take it. Should we return it to him or not? He said, my daughter, it's like Hebrew, it's affectionate, BT, you know. One who has a deposit with him must return it to its owner. She said to him, were it not for your consent, I would not have given it to him. What did she do? She grabbed his hand, brought him up to that room, had him approach the bed. She took off the sheet from upon them. When he saw both of them dead and lying on the bed, he began to cry and say, my sons, my teachers, my teachers. My sons in the way of the world, my teachers in that they would enlighten my eyes with their Torah. At that time, she said to Rabbi Meir, Rabbi, is it not what I told you? Do I need to return the deposit? Do I not need to return the deposit to its owner? He said, the Lord has given, and the Lord has taken. May the name of the Lord be blessed. This is a verse in Iyov, in Job. Rabbi Hananiah said, with this thing she consoled him, and his mind became composed. This is why it states, a valiant woman who can find. The story did not need any commentary. It's quite a story. Yeah, it's a very moving story. I'm not going to comment. Okay. So, good question. So we know, a good question. I don't know. I don't know. If he had any more children. I don't know. Okay, so now this section of the Gemara, which is Avodah Zarah, page 18a and 18b, Google it and read it, because it's a fascinating story. It begins before what we're about to read. The entire section before what we're about to read is the description of Hanina ben Trajan's death by the Romans. Now, in this story, the Romans are apparently after his whole family, not just him. So, Beruria's mother and sister are like sold into slavery. And her sister ends up in a brothel. Now, I mentioned before that one of the Mishnah said it was the daughter of Hananiah versus the brother of Hananiah. And we assume the daughter is Beruria, but maybe it was the other daughter, in which case there's two sisters who are scholars. We don't know, because it just says the daughter of Hananiah spoke better than the brother. Right? So maybe it's the other daughter, which we're about to read about. Right? So Beruria's sister is now taken captive, and after this whole kerfuffle with her father dying, it's traumatic. It's crazily traumatic. She's burnt alive with the Torah wrapped around him. I mean, like, it's a wild story. Mother is sold to slavery and sister taken to a brothel. So the Gemara tells us the following. The Gemara relates, Beruria, the wife of Rabbi Meir, was the daughter of Rabbi Hananiah ben Trajan, whose death we just described. She said to Rabbi Meir, is it a disrespectful matter for me that my sister is sitting in a brothel? You must do something to save her. So Rabbi Meir took a vessel, Tarkeva, full of dinars and went. He said to himself, if no transgression was committed with her, meaning we know she's in a brothel, so if she didn't misbehave, if she stayed faithful, a miracle will be performed for her. If she committed a transgression, no miracle will be performed for her. I can't do anything for her. So let's see. Rabbi Meir went and dressed as a Roman knight. This Rabbi Meir disguising himself is going to become a theme in the story. Rabbi Meir went and dressed as a Roman knight, and he said to her, he recognizes her, he goes to the brothel basically, he recognizes her, she doesn't recognize him. And he says, accede to my wishes, namely engage in intercourse with me. She said to him, I am menstruating, tashtana, and cannot. He said to her, I'll wait. She said to him, there are many more women in the brothel, and there are many more women who are much more beautiful than I. He said to himself, I can conclude from her responses that she did not commit a transgression, and she presumably said this to all who came. She's stalling anybody who shows up. Rabbi Meir went over to her guard and said to him, give her to me. The guard said to him, I fear that if I do so, I will be punished by the government. Right? This is a prisoner of Rome. Rabbi Meir said to him, take this vessel full of dinars, give half to the government as a bribe, and half will be with you. The guard said to him, but when the money is finished, what shall I do? Rabbi Meir said to him, say these words, God of Meir, answer me. Anybody know the phrase in Aramaic? Elakad Rabbi Meir aneni. This is where it comes from. The God of Rabbi Meir, answer me. In other words, he's telling the guard, you invoke the mitzvah that I'm doing here, and God will protect you. In other words, he's extending the merit of what he's doing onto the guard. And you will be saved. The guard said to him, and who can say that this is the case, that I will be saved by this utterance? He's not buying it. Rabbi Meir said to him, you will see now. There were these carnivorous dogs that would devour people. I guess they're guards of the prison brothel. Rabbi Meir took a clod of earth, threw it at them. right? So they were agitated now. And when they came to him to devour him, he said, Elakada Meir Aneni, God of Meir, answer me. The dogs then left him alone. And after seeing this, the guard was convinced and gave the daughter of Hananiah ben Trajan to Rabbi Meir. Ultimately, the matter was heard to the king's court, and the guard, who was brought and taken to be hanged, said, God of Meir, answer me. They then lowered him down as they were unable to hang him, miraculously. They said to him, what is this? Like, why can't we hang you? He said to them, this was the incident that occurred, and he proceeded to relate the entire story to them. So I'm miracle protected, sorry. So they left him alone, apparently. They then went, and so now they're trying to track down Rabbi Meir, who did this whole scheme. They went and engraved the image of Rabbi Meir at the entrance of Rome, where it would be seen by everyone. So they hung up posters with Rabbi Meir's picture. And they said, anyone who sees a man with this face should bring him here. Maybe there was even a reward. One day, Romans saw Rabbi Meir and ran after him, and he ran away from them and entered a brothel to hide. Some say, there's different versions to how he hid. Some say he then escaped capture because he saw food cooked by Gentiles and dipped this finger in the food and tasted it with another finger. In other words, right? And thereby fooled them to thinking that he was eating their food, which they knew Rabbi Meir would not do. So he pretended to be eating not kosher. And some say that he escaped detection because Elijah came, appeared to them as a prostitute, and embraced Rabbi Meir. So he's hugging Eliyahu, the prophet, and they're seeing him with the woman. So that can't be Rabbi Meir, for sure not. The Romans were chasing him, and the Romans who were chasing him said, heaven forbid if this were Rabbi Meir, he would not act in that manner. Top page 18. Rabbi Meir arose, fled, and arrived in Babylonia. Right? The Romans controlled all that area up onto the river. What was the river called? That separates Babylonia from the southern part, like Iraq and Iran. And he goes over the river, and he's in Babylonia. He's saved. Right? This is the slow migration of Jews to Babylonia. Rabbi Meir running away from the Romans. Many other Jews doing very similar things, running away from Romans. No, I think it's the Euphrates. It's one of the rivers. It's one of the rivers there that divided in the Romans. It was the Roman Empire versus the Persian Empire, right? I think it was. And he ran to the other government, which was nicer, and that's the Jews slowly started going there. Okay, the Gemara notes that there are those who say that he fled because of this incident, and there are those who say he fled due to an embarrassment from the incident involving his wife Beruria. No comment from the Gemara about what the story with Beruria is. And this is a mystery. What is this story with Beruria that was so embarrassing that made Rabbi Meir run away? Okay, so viewer discretion. The story I'm about to tell you is a very wild story, but wait till the end and we'll clear it all up. But as we're going to read it now, it's very strange, and you'll see in a minute why. So there's no comment what the story is. Like, what did Beruria do? Meaning, the story that just happened where he's running away from the Romans makes sense enough. Additionally, and maybe we'll circle back to this soon, is the fact that the Romans are after the entire Hananiah family. They sent the wife, they sent one daughter off, maybe they're looking for the other daughter and son-in-law. Additionally, it says Rabbi Meir ran away without his wife. Like, where's Beruria? Did she run away with him? Like, she's probably also wanted by the Romans, would she not be? Her sister was taken, maybe she too, right? So there's a lot of unresolved questions here. So let's begin with this little controversial story. So we have Rashi's commentary on this passage, which says there's another incident, some embarrassing incident involving Beruria and why he ran away. And Rashi writes the following. Now let's keep in mind that Rashi is a few centuries after Rabbi Meir and Beruria. Right? He's living in France. We learned about him a couple months ago. He's living in France hundreds of years after the Gemara is redacted and concluded. And this is before the Gemara starts. This is the Mishnaic era. So it's hundreds of years later. Between then and Rashi, no comment on the story of Beruria. And then we have Rashi's seemingly very bizarre comment, which says, one time, she made fun of the sages. The sages said that women are easily seduced. Daiton kalas, they don't have what's the word? The mental fortitude to withstand temptation. Something of that nature. And she was laughing at this. What do you mean? So, Rabbi Meir said to her, oh, you're going to fall for the same trick that the sages are saying. It's a wild story. And Rabbi Meir sends one of his students to try to entice her until she acquiesced. And when she found out, she essentially committed suicide. And that's why Rabbi Meir ran away. This is the story Rashi says. I hope you have a lot of questions on the story. It's just a wild, wild story. And I read this, I was like, okay, something's going on here. So, did a little digging. And here are two fellows that live in Jerusalem. One passed away. And they also discussed the story. There's so many questions in the story. To start with, why would Rabbi Meir do such a thing? Like, all we know about Rabbi Meir and Beruria's relationship is a good one. Like, why would he do something like that? There's so many halachic problems also. You're not allowed to put a stumbling block in front of, it's not, you're halachically forbidden to try to get someone to do something like that. And he's instructing his student to engage in adultery. The whole thing is so bizarre on so many levels. Like, what is going on in the story? So, I found the following. So I actually found some Kabbalistic, yeah?
I'm saying, before we go into that part, we didn't really finish what happened. Like, he saved her sister, and he brought her home. Was she all happy? Like, nothing.
Good point. Well, I'm going to circle back to that. Because it doesn't say anything. It just says he saved her, and then the next part of the story is the Romans are chasing him.
Yeah.
Right? So what's going on? Good question. So we'll get to that in a second. Yeah, it's good you picked up on that. Okay, so I did see a few like Kabbalistic explanations to the story. That doesn't jive with the literal, like just the literal story. Even if you have a Kabbalistic explanation behind it, it doesn't explain just the literal the morality of it, the halacha of it, the sense of it. The whole thing is bizarre. Anyway, so this rabbi here on the left, his name is Rabbi Yaakov Adis. You can see him today if you visit the Kotel. Look out for him. He's the guy wearing a tallis. He's like lives this ascetic, tzaddik profile type life. He gives speeches at the Kotel. He prays early in the morning out loud with massive crowds around him. He spends his whole day in a talit, sometimes wearing tefillin late also in the day. I once heard him give a actually fantastically motivating speech to a whole group of soldiers at the Kotel. I once just happened to walk in there. He was doing it. So this is him. His name is Rabbi Yaakov Adis. And he has a series of books called Divrei Yaakov, the words of Yaakov, his name being Yaakov. And they're basically, a lot of them are basically commentary on conversations he's had with scholars that live in Jerusalem, including with Rabbi Yosef Shalom Eliashiv, the famous Lithuanian scholar who passed away in 2012, very recently. A major also scholar. Both of these people, you can Google their names, you can find tons of videos on them, you can see videos of them speaking and whatnot. I mean, they're very well-known figures.
He's known as the Grish?
Yes. So Divrei Yaakov, Betshuvos HaGrish. Grish stands for Hagon, the scholar, Yosef Shalom. Sometimes Grisha, like Eliashiv, the Aleph for Eliashiv. Okay, so he writes the following. I'm just going to read it in translation. It's a whole section he has there, the conversation he has with Rabbi Eliashiv about making children's books out of stories from the Talmud as a means to inspire them, and whether you should or shouldn't or can or allowed to modify the story or exaggerate the story for the purposes of inspired drama, I guess. So he says like this. So this is a conversation that these two scholars are having. So I'm just translating into English. So by the way, with respect to talking to the rabbi about stories, I should tell you that in the winter of 1994, I was sitting with Rabbi Eliashiv in his home. He gives when he thinks it was. And the story, our conversation got to the fact that the rabbi, Rabbi Eliashiv, praised Beruria, the wife of Rabbi Meir, in being this great scholar of one who learns lots of Torah. He cites the Talmud we quoted earlier, where she learned 300 halachot a day. So I said to the rabbi, you know, the end of Beruria's story is not a very happy ending, as said in Rashi in Avodah Zarah. Now I should pause here and say that there are some sources that actually have cited the story who want to bolster their view that women shouldn't learn, and they point to Beruria and say, well, you see the end? Wasn't so good in the end. So it's kind of used as that story. So this is what Rabbi Adis is telling Rabbi Eliashiv. So it seems to me, says Rabbi Adis, that the rabbi responded by saying that this story never happened. And he said so with like Benachotis Tuva, which is like with great certainty, like that story never happened. Okay. So continues about this, I need to understand what he means because the story is stated in Rashi. So what do I do? And moreover, Rashi is indicating that this is the meaning of the Gemara, which says that Meir ran away because of that story. So he just writes off a story that Rashi has in his commentary. You can't do that. So it seemed to me, continues about this, that Rabbi Elyashiv was of the view that a mistaken story, a mistaken student, put the story into the Talmud using Rashi's style of writing, but Rashi would have never wrote the story. That's quite a claim. So just to explain. Sorry? Is it a forgery? Let's see. So there is a scholar named Rabbi Eitam Henkin. You should remember, you should know the name. He was murdered, him and his wife, in front of his children. And a Palestinian terrorist basically killed him and his wife in front of children. They tried to kidnap the children. This was a major event in 2014 or 2015. Right? He was stopped by a whole group of terrorists. And anyway, so he wrote this Eitam, and he wrote on the subject. And he also, like everybody else, he does a very deep scholarly treatment of this whole Rashi and the way it was looked at. And he doesn't cite to this book, this source, but he also makes the claim that Rashi never wrote it. And there's a very compelling argument, actually. He basically writes that throughout the 400 years after Rashi's commentary is written, all the Tosafists, which are Rashi's grandchildren, who are constantly arguing with Rashi, never make mention of the story. There are so many questions on the story that the first people to have argued would have been the Tosafists, and there's not a comment. In fact, he says, on the very same page of Talmud, there's a comment from Tosafist about suicide, and no mention of the story of Beruria, which makes it even more curious. So he explains how Torah was transmitted pre-printing press. Pre-printing press, you have copyists who are constantly copying from one to the other. Now, if I get one such copy, right, and I want to write take notes on my learning, many people today use margins of books, but certainly then, because paper would have been expensive. So you're putting your notes into the margins. Fast forward 60 years, someone picks up my copy, decides to copy it down, and what happens? My notes get inserted into wherever. So he contends that this story, he gives a whole backstory where he thinks the story actually emerged from, that the story emerged from somewhere else, and he gives like a whole timeline of the first time it appears in post-Rashi commentaries. Like, when are the first time that there are commentaries making note of Rashi saying this bizarre story? And the first time that happens is hundreds of years later, and he gives a whole scholarly workaround as to why he believes that it was never written by Rashi. And it was inserted by someone from some folklore, put in the notes, and that was copied and copied and copied, and became inserted into Rashi. He adds, which is ironic in some way, that Rashi himself, I think we discussed this once when we learned Rashi's lifetime and biography, Rashi himself and many of the scholars in his time, they were busy with collecting manuscripts of Talmud and trying to find the most accurate one, because the same mistakes would happen. I'm hand copying your Talmud, and you happen to put some notes in there, now it gets stuck in there. Now all of a sudden my Talmud has extra words and don't belong there. And someone else copies it, and someone else copies it, right? So there are scholars who spend, and there are tons of books written about this, trying to find the most accurate version of the Talmud. And there are sometimes where Rashi himself will write, you know, this version, not a good one. I found a different version, and this one makes more sense. So he's contending, this Rabbi Henkin of blessed memory, may God avenge his blood, he contends that the same thing happened to this comment in Rashi and does not belong here. So taking Rabbi Henkin's scholarly work and Rabbi Elyashiv's insistence that Rashi never wrote it, I'll take it. Yeah.
Is this the only instance where there's controversy with regards to Rashi?
No. There are others. So actually, funnily enough, the story we read today about Rav Papa, remember? Yeah. It's another one of those stories where the Gemara says there's an incident about Rav Papa without saying what the story is, and Rashi tells us the story. But in that case, there are like 10 other scholars that say the same story, and people from previous generations who say the same story, and people right after Rashi who say the same story, making it assume that this is more an accurate lineage, just, slight variations in the story. But this story of Beruria appears nowhere, not before Rashi, not after Rashi, for another couple hundred years. So therefore he argues that it was never in Rashi. I'll take his word for it. Now, he goes on to say, this Rabbi Adis says a very similar thing, not with the same academic rigor that Rabbi Henkin does, but a similar kind of comment he makes here. So now what is the story then? What is the incident of Beruria? that would make Reb Meir run away. There's two options for why he ran away. He's running away from the Romans because they're chasing him down because he stole a woman from captivity, or the story with Beruria. Which incident? So Rabbi Henkin argues, and he has good backing for this, that the story we read in the Talmud are actually two different narratives. Narrative one is the incident of Beruria, where she tells her husband, that's how the whole story starts out. Beruria is the daughter of Hananiah. She tells her husband, my sister is in a brothel, go save him. And where does the story end? It just, like, the trail, the story just stops. That's it. It just says she saved him. They come back home, nothing. And the next thing is, sometime later, they're trying to kill the guy. Right? It's years later when they catch the guy. They're trying to hang him. He says this is what happened to me with Reb Meir, and they start chasing Reb Meir down. So he argues that these two incidents are two separate stories. That they're one story, but they're framed as two narratives. So there's either two reasons for Reb Meir to run away, either because he's running away because he is being chased by the Romans, or option B is because Beruria sent him off to a brothel somewhere. And there's the embarrassing story with Beruria. And it's backed up by at least one version of the Talmud, which says that Reb Meir ran away to Babylonia with his wife Beruria. So if Rabbi Henkin's right, and I'll take his word, then that would mean that actually Reb Meir, because he was saving the honor of his wife's family, ran away to Babylonia with his wife Beruria. That'd be certainly a much neater version to the story than this personality who was very strong, very witty, very smart, admired by the sages, who's now being tricked by her husband, who's one of those sages who admire her, and then he ends up taking her own life. I mean, the whole thing is so bizarre that Rabbi Henkin's version of the story sits more comfortably. And I think the strongest argument to be made for Rabbi Henkin's case is the fact that, as he said, there's no other source, not before Rashi or after Rashi discusses the story, until years later it creeps up in commentaries discussing what Rashi's thinking. So that's as far as the story of Beruria goes. Okay, sorry, yeah?
So to clarify, he is suggesting that Rashi's commentary got slipped in there on the account of that it was commentary on the side that made it into...
It's not the only incident of that.
Right.
There are other instances where we know that that's what happened, because we analyze manuscripts, and you have like a variation and emendations to the text. Like there are times when we actually know that happened.
Right, okay.
In this case, we don't know. Rabbi Henkin's making a very strong case for why that is. And the strongest case is just the bizarre nature of the story.
Yeah.
That is like moral issues, halachic issues, not consistent with Reb Meir and Beruria's relationship throughout the rest of the Talmud. Right? She's engaging her husband to go save his sister.
Yeah.
He runs off faithfully to go wherever, and he does this whole trickery to go and performs miracles to save. And this is the same guy who turns around and tricks his wife. The whole thing is so bizarre.
Yeah.
Sorry? I don't know that Rabbi Henkin has broad enough shoulders to make all Talmudic printings to decide to delete a passage from Rashi that has been in there for hundreds of years at least. So,
What would be the source of a comment like that? It was a discussion, or
He-
somebody had this idea that, oh, maybe that's what happened?
he suggests it's folklore. He cites to another example where folklore about Aristotle ended up in one of these comments also. He demonstrates that. So he has like this whole thesis about it. It's not so clear cut, obviously, because he had to write a whole
So
like-
it could have just been a student who was annoyed with her because she was smarter than him.
No,
and
it's-
made it up?
the story. No, the student would have been no.
What would have been
The student here is not a student of Reb Meir. The student here is not the student who would insert the story would have been hundreds of years later,
Where would someone make that up?
after Rashi. He heard the story, so he wrote it into the margins of his book.
Like broken telephone? Oh, she
Sorry?
went off and ran off.
Yeah. That's the funny thing. We don't know the source. There's no other source. There's always stories have a source from somewhere else. There's no other source of the story. It's someone heard the story, put it into the margins of his book, hundreds of years after it happened. He's suggesting even decades after Rashi died, someone is copying Rashi's book into his own notes, and then while learning heard the story, so wrote it down, and then just got inserted by the next copyist.
Could he have been making a joke, writing something on the margin and passing it to a friend?
Maybe. Maybe. It's very bizarre. It's truly a mystery.
Someone believed it when
It's,
he wrote it.
Google the mysterious incident of Beruria, and you'll have all of these theories pop up there. There's tons written. No.
You know how she
So we don't.
Nothing.
Other than this, I don't know if you want to know if it's called a theory, this fable. Other than the fable, we have no knowledge of how she died. But you can imagine a woman like this. Also, think of her personality. She watched her father get brutally murdered, commissions her husband to save her sister. She's the strong one when they lose 2 children, and then this happens. The whole thing doesn't.
She also was careful with Yitzhak.
Okay, that's Devorah, but still, yeah, nonetheless.
Sorry.
Yeah. Anyway, that's the story of Beruria. A very fascinating personality, as you can see. A very smart woman, a witty woman. It doesn't make sense for the personality she would have fallen for something like this. It doesn't add up. That's the biggest trouble.
The student have to do everything the rabbi tells him? Like, I'm thinking.
So I
the
saw one.
rabbi took the student and told him to go and do this.
So I saw one commentary that said that the student was a eunuch. So it was like, yeah. So it was.
They were Jewish eunuchs.
The whole thing is so straight. It just adds another
Yeah. It's
bizarre element. It doesn't solve the problem of like first of all the moral issue and the halachic issue of putting a stumbling block. The whole thing is just bizarre. But how you slice the story. So you want to say something?
Was there ever a suggestion that Rabbi Meir saved Beruria's sister? He went up with her and let.
Well, clearly Beruria trusted him with that, right? Beruria trusted him with that mission.
Yeah.
She, which could explain why the Gemara starts off by saying Beruria sent him on the mission, as opposed to saying Rabbi Meir, being the son-in-law, went to find the sister-in-law. It starts off by saying Rabbi Beruria is the daughter, and she went to her husband and said, how could you let my family rot like this? Go save him. Right? So she commissioned him on this whole, so she clearly trusted him. Right? Which then to turn around and do this adds to the whole. Anyway, yep.
The point of debate is really just the second passage where he fled and fled Babylonia.
Okay, so he fled either because of this incident with the Roman chasing him,
Right.
or because of the story with Beruria.
Right.
What's that? The Gemara doesn't say. Hundreds of years later, there's a Rashi that emerges.
But this place where he's chased and doing the tricks of the
That's in the Talmud.
That's
That's in the Talmud.
Right.
That's in the Talmud directly. That's in the Talmud directly.
That's not debated, just this part.
That's right. Which would add, it mentions that he was embarrassed, right? It would add to the embarrassing element, because according to some of the stories, he was observed, at least by those looking around,
Right.
as entering a brothel now for the second time, right? And eating not kosher.
Right.
So maybe that adds to the embarrassment. But his wife knows what's up, so she runs off with him, right? Because she knows that he was faithful the whole time.
But he
So maybe
was
that's
in
what's going on.
But he was in costume the first time.
The first time he was in a costume, yeah. But it would have, yeah, I guess it would have been known later, or at least the sister-in-law knew for sure, right?
Oh, right.
Because he saved her,
Right.
right? It's a pretty wild story, all to say. Sorry?
You know what Nessos afterwards spoke about them?
Nothing.
Saw them vanished.
All the sources I showed you. That's it. There's nothing else. It's pretty wild, yeah?
But Rabbi Meir came back to Israel.
First, and then went to Rome. And then ran to Babylonia, yeah.
But then he came back. He's buried in
At the end of his life, maybe.
and there's
Because he's buried in Israel, yeah.
so we don't know.
Okay, we have to look at the Meir's biography. Do I have it here? Oh, I don't have it here. There's a book I used for the Beruria part, at least for a lot of it. It is a book called Introduction to the Talmud by Art Scroll. Highly recommended book. And they give like a brief biography of all the sages of the Talmud, including Beruria, and they give you like the sources. So a lot of the stuff I picked up from there. And so I was going to look over there to see what they say about Rabbi Meir's death, but I don't see the book here. Anyway, so there you have at least. Okay, so next week we'll look at the woman who was a teacher in Babylonia. That will be our first biography for next week. At least we see here 2 personalities in the biblical era and the Talmudic era, both strong personalities described as women of great character. And I hope you guys enjoyed.